He's Mike Florio from Pro Football Talk, the NBC Sports Network, and also NBC Radio. You can hear it and watch it right before this program, 6 to 9 a.m. Eastern, every day, Monday through Friday on the NBC Sports Network. All right, Mike. First of all, summarize what the commissioner's letter and the initiative was of this $100 million safety campaign.
Well, it's a very wide-ranging attempt to continue the efforts to, number one, prevent concussions, number two, ensure that players who have concussions are getting proper treatment before they're put back on the field. And they are taking this very seriously. It's easy to look at it and say it's for PR, and to a certain extent it is. But they also are trying to solve the problem. They're talking about developing new helmets that are specific to the positions that players play, because you have different types of blows to the head based upon whether you're an offensive lineman or a running back or a receiver or a defensive back. And they think that within 3 to 5 years they'll have helmets that can greatly reduce concussions. Now, you ultimately can't eliminate them, because when the human body is moving and abruptly stops, the brain bounces off the inside of the skull and can be damaged. But they keep trying to make the game safer, whether it's minimizing kickoff returns, which isn't going so well so far this year, but they are looking for ways to make the game safer. They're taking it seriously because they do understand that if you choke off the supply of football players because their parents won't let them play because the sport is perceived to be too dangerous, you're ultimately not going to have an NFL.
Why doesn't the NFL have a targeting rule like college does?
Yeah, I heard you talking about that, and it's great stuff, and I'm going to find out whether or not this is something that would have to go through the collective bargaining process. I don't know that they could change the rules that dramatically without union consent. Maybe they can, but that's a big deal, that you can eject a player and discipline a player for that type of an infraction when that's not a rule that's currently on the books. And it could be that they're just not prepared to go to the bargaining table and make a concession to the union in order to get the ability to eject players for targeting. That would be one potential explanation. And maybe that's the only one, because the NFL prides itself, Dan, on having rule changes that trickle down to lower levels of the sport. Mm-hmm. It shouldn't be that a rule change is trickling up, a rule change that promotes player safety and tries to get players to play the game a certain way. Brandon Marshall of the Broncos yesterday said that the Broncos aren't dirty because they don't twist ankles and gouge eyes, but when you are playing with a level of reckless abandon that doesn't take into account the obligation you have to not throw your helmet into the body of a quarterback, you are playing dirty because you are playing with willful ignorance, deliberate ignorance of what the rules require, and you are taking those risks by using your helmet as a weapon, even though you aren't deliberately trying to injure the guy.
Yeah, and I don't know what the process would be, but if you do view somebody as targeting, like Brandon Marshall did to Cam Newton, Brandon Marshall has nothing to lose here. What, 15 yards? Maybe he gets fined $20,000. If you ding the bell of Cam Newton or knock him out of the game, what? I would do that if I'm a defensive player. I'm a hero.
And remember that day, it was October 17, 2010, where there were 3 vicious helmet-to-helmet hits in real time. We were watching the games at the NBC studio at the time at 30 Rock, and within 5 minutes, it was Brandon Merriweather on Todd Heap, it was James Harrison on Muhammad Massaquoi, and it was Dante Robinson on Deshaun Jackson. And that sparked a conversation. And Rodney Harrison made the point that night on Football Night in America, I set money aside for the fines.
Yeah.
I don't care about the fines. The only thing that's going to stop me from playing like that is being taken off the field for a week. And we still haven't seen the kind of increase in suspensions that maybe we need to have. And it sure felt like something was going on Thursday night, Dan. It reminded me of the NFC Championship game, Saints-Vikings, the bounty game, where they were doing everything they could to knock Favre out of the game. I felt like the Broncos, strategically, not because anybody was giving anybody an envelope with $100 in it, but strategically deciding to go after Cam Newton to either knock him out of the game or to render him less effective because he's been banged around. And it worked.
We're talking to Mike Florio from Pro Football Talk. Before I let you go, I still don't understand what happened on Monday night with Antonio Brown and Josh Norman. At some point, if I'm Jay Gruden, I say, that guy Antonio Brown's getting open. He's pretty good. Why wouldn't I have Josh Norman on him? Now you have Des Bryant and the Cowboys next game. Is Josh Norman going to be on one side and Des Bryant is going to be on the other?
This is apparently what they did in Carolina. Most of the time, he was on one side. So I don't know how he ends up on Odell Beckham Jr. all the time. Just put Odell Beckham Jr. where Josh Norman isn't.
Yeah.
So Washington seems to be locked into this idea of keeping Norman on one side of the field. They had a lot of faith in Bashaud Breeland, and I think they still do. It's just Antonio Brown is that good. And Ben Roethlisberger, who doesn't get nearly enough credit for what he's become late in his career, he's getting better all the time. He's putting those balls in there that are almost impossible to defend. Even Deion Sanders in his prime would have a hard time with this. But the bottom line is, you're going to pay a guy $15 million a year, and you're going to tell him you just stay on this side of the field. Now, that works if you're the Seahawks and you have the rest of the Legion of Boom. When the Packers, for example, decide they're just going to ignore Josh Norman week 1 of 2014, or not Josh Norman, but Richard Sherman, and throw the ball on the other side of the field. When you don't have the rest of the secondary to back up Josh Norman, that's not going to work for Washington. So they better start thinking about putting him on the number one receiver every week, or number one, this is going to keep happening, and number two, they're never going to get their money's worth.
How much pressure is on the Rams now, given that performance, if you want to call that, in San Francisco, and you see Carson Wentz starting for Philadelphia, Jared Goff maybe as the backup quarterback, and I'm looking at maybe down the road they host Buffalo in a few weeks. Maybe that's where you unveil him, but do you think the Rams are inching closer and closer to putting Goff in there?
Well, here's the thing that struck me. The most significant thing I saw Monday night, Case Keenum had a C on his jersey. He's a captain on that team. He was voted a captain by the players after the offseason program, preseason, training camp, etc. They have their vote, and they make Keenum a captain knowing that Jared Goff is the chosen one, knowing that the team moved from 15 to number 1 specifically to get Jared Goff. What does that tell you if the players think Keenum is a captain? That tells me that Keenum's their quarterback and that Goff isn't, and they know that there's a gap there. And it's alarming when you think, this isn't the Rams earning the number 1 overall pick and say, hey, we got to pick somebody. This is the Rams at number 15 saying, we are moving up from 15 to 1 because Goff is our guy. And it's glaring that he wasn't in uniform on Monday night. And now you have to ask yourself, at what point do they just throw caution to the wind, and what kind of problems is that going to cause in the locker room when the veterans have already spoken that Keenum is their captain, Keenum is their quarterback?
Thank you, Mike.
All right, see you, buddy.
That's Mike Florio from Pro Football Talk.
The Dan Patrick Show, weekday mornings on Audience.